Before Athens raised the Parthenon, before Homer's heroes set sail for Troy, before the word Greece meant anything at all, an island civilization was already rising. It built vast stone courts. It launched ships across the eastern Mediterranean. It painted its walls with dolphins and processions, and it kept the record of its wealth in a script no one has been able to decipher securely. Then the world it built came apart. Its political order fractured. Its language slipped out of the surviving record. Its great centers burned, changed hands, and finally fell silent. And here is the strangest part. We don't even know what these people called themselves. The name we use, Minoan, is modern, borrowed from King Minos, a ruler who may belong more to legend than to history. This civilization helped shape the entire Aegean world, yet it entered our imagination through ruins, myths, and reconstructions built centuries after the fact. Before we can understand how it rose and how it fell, we have to do something difficult. Separate the people who actually lived on Bronze Age Crete from the story later generations invented about them. Crete sits between worlds. To the north, the Cycladic Islands and the Greek mainland. To the east, Anatolia and Cyprus. Further south and southeast, Egypt and the harbors of the Levant. Look at the sea from the shore, and it seems like a wall, isolation, distance, empty water. But to a sailor who knows its currents, that same sea is something else entirely. A road system with no stone paving, running in every direction at once. People had farmed this island since the 7th millennium BCE. At sites like Knossos, one settlement rose on top of the ruins of another, layer after layer, for thousands of years. A slow accumulation of lives, long before anyone thought to call it a civilization. The island did not wake up one morning to find palaces standing. Its transformation crept forward, generation by generation. Villages grew. Crafts became more specialized. Local leaders began to display their status through carved seals, fine jewelry, stone vessels, and imported materials that spoke of connections beyond the shoreline. The networks came first. The monuments came later. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, two forces were reshaping Cretan life: bronze and the long-distance trade required to obtain it. Crete itself was generous. It produced grain, olives, grapes, wool, timber, pottery, textiles. But the metals needed for bronze had to be imported, and so did ivory, precious stones, gold, and silver. Every object that arrived on Cretan shores carried more than its material worth. Each one carried knowledge of shipping routes, of foreign demand, of rival ports, of political shifts happening in places most Cretans would never see. This is where the familiar legend begins, the idea of a Minoan sea empire. Later Greek traditions spoke of Minos ruling the waves, and early modern scholars once imagined a centralized thalassocracy commanding the whole Aegean. But here is the fact. No surviving Minoan text claims dominion over the sea. Not one. What their influence may actually have looked like is something less like an empire with fixed borders, and more like a web: harbors, partnerships, prestige, access. Control the movement of people and goods, and power can travel a very long way without a single soldier ever setting foot on a foreign shore. Around 1900 BCE, that power found a new shape, in stone and mortar. Monumental complexes rose at Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and other centers across the island. Historians call them palaces, but the word is misleading. Elites likely lived inside them, yes, but they were also storerooms, workshops, ritual spaces, archives, courts, gathering grounds. These buildings didn't just display authority, they organized it. Step inside and imagine the machinery of a society running in plain sight. Oil, grain, textiles, crafted goods, labor, offerings, information, all of it gathered, counted, stored, redistributed. Rows of huge clay jars stood in long magazines, taller than a person. Carved seals authenticated containers and sealed transactions. Scribes incised signs representing commodities into wet clay before it hardened into a permanent record. Courtyards drew crowds into spaces built to be seen in. The architecture itself turned bookkeeping into theater. Knossos became the most famous of them all, partly for its sheer scale, and partly for what modern excavation later made it represent. Walk its corridors, and they change direction without warning. Stairways link levels that don't quite align. Light wells cut down into darkness, pulling sunlight into rooms that should have none. Doors could seal a suite shut or throw it open. Beneath parts of the complex, drainage channels still survive. To anyone standing inside, the building could feel almost alive, endlessly revealing a new space, then just as quickly concealing another. It's easy to see why later generations looked at this and thought, Labyrinth. But a resemblance is not proof. The Greek stories of Minos, Daedalus, Ariadne, Theseus, and the Minotaur were written down centuries after the Bronze Age had already ended. They might preserve some distant memory of Cretan power, of tribute, of ritual, of architecture too complex for outsiders to fully grasp. Or they might be stories reshaped again and again, retold for new audiences who had never set foot on Crete at all. Archaeology can hold myth up against evidence. It cannot turn myth into an eyewitness account. And even the palace standing at Knossos today isn't simply a Bronze Age ruin, frozen at the moment of its fall. Its ancient occupants rebuilt it again and again over the centuries. Then, in the 20th century, the excavator Arthur Evans rebuilt it once more, this time in concrete, in paint, in confident interpretation. Some of what he added helped the public picture a vanished world. It also blurred a crucial line, the line between what was discovered and what was imagined back into being. Evans did more than dig. He named this civilization. He built a story around it. In his version, Crete was ruled from Knossos by a priest king, commanding the sea, honoring a great goddess, living out a long, peaceful golden age. It was an elegant vision, a memorable one, and only partly supported by the evidence. Much of it remains possible. None of it can be mistaken for the Minoans' own account of themselves. That account is locked behind writing no one has yet deciphered securely. Bronze Age Crete used more than one script. Cretan hieroglyphic appears on seals and tablets. Linear A was used widely for administration and ritual inscriptions. Scholars can pick out numbers, recurring signs, patterns that look like accounting. They can sometimes guess at a place name or a commodity, but the language underneath, the actual words these people spoke, remains sealed shut. That silence changes everything. Egypt left royal inscriptions carved to outlast empires. Mesopotamia left letters, laws, myths, entire libraries. The later Mycenaeans wrote in Linear B, a script that records an early form of Greek, one we can actually read. The Minoans left archives too, but not a single one that securely tells us the name of a ruler, the structure of a government, or what they believed had happened when their world began to break apart. So historians have had to reconstruct this civilization from images instead of words. And in Minoan art, women appear again and again, richly dressed, placed at the center of ceremonies. This suggests something real. Female figures likely held major symbolic, religious, or social importance. What it doesn't prove is that Crete was ruled by women, or organized as a matriarchy. A painted figure could be a goddess, a priestess, an elite woman at a ritual, an idealized image with no single living counterpart. Visibility in art is evidence. It is not a constitution. The same caution has to apply to the so-called snake goddesses. These small figurines from Knossos became icons of Minoan religion, and yet their true identity is still uncertain, and some of the most famous examples were reconstructed from broken fragments, with missing elements supplied by modern restorers. Peak sanctuaries, sacred caves, offerings, double axes, bull's horns, images of animals everywhere. Together they sketch a rich ritual landscape. What they don't reveal is a single, uniform religion, practiced the same way, island-wide for centuries. Then there is the bull. It appears on seals, on vessels, in frescoes, and its power was clearly, unmistakably meaningful. The most famous images show human figures moving around a charging animal, in what's commonly called bull leaping. Was this a real, physical performance? Or does the image compress several separate actions into one symbolic scene? Scholars are still divided on how literally to read it. But whatever the exact ritual behind it, the message on the wall needs no translation. A human body enters the space of overwhelming strength and survives through timing or training or the favor of something greater. It's an image built to outlive its own explanation. This sense of movement runs through almost everything the Minoans painted. Dolphins arc through blue water. Birds lift off painted landscapes. Plants bend as if a real wind had just passed through the room. Processions advance across entire walls. Marine creatures curl themselves around pottery instead of sitting stiffly inside a border. Set beside the rigid, formal royal art of neighboring civilizations, Minoan imagery can feel startlingly spontaneous, almost modern, even now. But even here, certainty slips through your fingers. Many of the most famous frescoes survive only as small fragments: a hand, a curl of hair, a fraction of a wave. Missing bodies, faces, garments, entire backgrounds were completed by modern restorers, working from imagination as much as evidence. Some of the scenes familiar from every textbook are part Bronze Age image, part 20th century decision. The Minoan world looks vivid to us today largely because modern hands reached in and filled its empty spaces. Behind all that beauty stood labor on an enormous scale. Farmers worked the plains and terraced hillsides. Shepherds supplied the enormous quantities of wool required by the textile economy. Potters managed carefully controlled kilns and worked with highly specialized firing techniques. Metal workers handled imported raw material that had traveled hundreds of miles to reach their hands. Stone carvers, painters, builders, sailors, scribes, textile workers, an entire economy oriented around the great complexes. The palace wasn't only a beautiful building, it was a machine, and its purpose was to convert human labor into stored wealth, ceremony, and political power. And that machine raises one of the biggest unanswered questions in all of Minoan studies. Who actually controlled the surplus? Were farmers meeting obligations to some central institution? Were several rival elite groups competing inside the very same center? Did temples, households, councils, or individual rulers divide authority between them? The architecture shows us coordination. Linear A shows us administration. Neither one gives us a throne with a name carved into it. That absence of an obvious ruler has led some to imagine Minoan Crete as unusually peaceful, unusually equal. And it's true. The island's major centers lacked the massive defensive walls later built at Mycenae and Tiryns. That contrast is real. But the conclusion people draw from it is not automatic. Open, unwalled centers might simply reflect a different kind of confidence, rooted in island geography, naval strength, alliances, a more dispersed structure of power, or different ideas about defense altogether. Weapons existed, fortified sites existed. Conflict did not vanish from Crete just because Knossos never built Cyclopean walls. Around 1700 BCE, the first age of palaces came to an end, in fire, at several centers at once. Earthquakes may have played a role, but the full picture is tangled, and no single cause explains every site. What happened next is more surprising than the destruction itself. The Minoans rebuilt. The new complexes rose larger, more elaborate, more tightly woven into the towns around them. This period, what archaeologists call the Neo-Palatial era, became the high point of Minoan architecture, art, administration, overseas influence. The disaster hadn't broken the system. It had cleared the ground for something more ambitious. Knossos grew, but it never stood alone. Phaistos looked out over the fertile Masara plain. Malia commanded key northern sea routes. Zakros linked eastern Crete to networks stretching further east still. Kydonia rose in the west. Zaminthos sat high in the mountains, in a position nothing else on the island shared. All of these centers shared a broad architectural and cultural language, court-centered planning, recurring symbols, related scripts, and recognizable artistic styles. Yet each was rooted in its own local world. Older histories placed the entire island under a single king ruling from Knossos. Many researchers today favor something more cautious. Crete may have held several competing polities, cooperating, intermarrying, sharing rituals, borrowing freely from one another, while never bowing to one throne. Cultural unity did not require political unity. From the outside, Crete could look like a single civilization. From the inside, it may have held multiple centers of power at once. That flexible network let Minoan influence travel far past the island's shores. Cretan styles turn up across the Cyclades, on Kythera, along stretches of the Anatolian coast, on the Greek mainland itself. At Akrotiri on Thera, the wall paintings and objects found there reveal deep, sustained contact with Crete. But calling every Minoan-looking settlement a colony risks erasing the choices of the people who actually lived there. Communities could adopt a foreign style simply because it carried prestige, and then reshape it into something entirely their own. In Egyptian tomb paintings, foreign envoys labeled as people of Keftiu appear carrying vessels that closely resemble Aegean work. Many scholars connect Keftiu with Crete, or with the wider Aegean world, though the exact geography remains debated. These images confirm one thing: contact happened. They do not hand us a map of Minoan sovereignty. At the same time, the mainland itself was changing. Early Mycenaean elites admired Minoan objects, imported Minoan symbols and artistic techniques, and possibly borrowed Minoan administrative practices as well. Cretan influence didn't simply radiate outward from some superior center. It was absorbed, deliberately, hungrily, by ambitious neighbors who were busy building power of their own. At its peak, the Minoan system looked remarkably resilient. It had already survived one collapse. Its ships linked distant ports across the sea. Its elites shared one powerful visual language. Its centers stored wealth and coordinated labor on a scale the island had never seen before. But the very network that created all that prosperity also created a hidden fragility. A maritime system runs on ports, on trust, on routes, on weather, on constant movement. Break enough of those links, and a civilization can remain standing on the surface, while the system underneath it quietly begins to fail. Then, roughly 100 kilometers north of Crete, the island of Thera erupted. The exact date remains debated, although recent radiocarbon evidence has strengthened the case for an eruption in the mid-16th century BCE. It reshaped Santorini's coastline. It buried Akrotiri under volcanic material. It sent ash drifting across the region. It was one of the largest known explosive eruptions of the Holocene. And for generations, it offered historians the perfect explanation for the end of the Minoans. It was dramatic. It was cinematic. It was also too simple. Tsunamis triggered by the eruption did reach parts of northern and eastern Crete. Coastal settlements, harbors, ships, farmland, maritime infrastructure, all of it may have suffered real damage. Earthquakes, ashfall, and disrupted trade routes could have deepened the crisis further. But the evidence does not show Minoan civilization vanishing in a single catastrophic day. Crete kept building, kept trading, kept administering its affairs long after the ash had settled. And that survival is what makes the real story so much more unsettling than the myth. A society can endure a catastrophe and still be permanently changed by it. Lost ships could weaken trade. Damaged ports might shift power inland. Failed harvests could erode confidence. Elites claiming ritual authority might struggle to explain why disaster struck at all. Rivals could sense weakness and move. The eruption may not have been the execution. It may have been only the first tremor in a much longer political unraveling. Around the middle of the 15th century BCE, destruction swept across the island once more. Fire consumed site after site. Knossos was the major exception. It survived and continued as a center of power. The pattern is unmistakably clear. Its cause is not. Earthquakes may have played a role. Internal conflict may have shattered old alliances. Groups from Mycenaean Greece may have attacked, intervened, or simply exploited a moment of instability. Several of these forces may have overlapped, turning regional instability into a wider transformation. Archaeology can show us the destruction layer, burned black into the earth. It cannot show us the sequence of decisions that led there. What came after is easier to trace. At Knossos, administrators began writing in Linear B, a script adapted from Linear A to record an early form of Greek. This places the palace firmly inside the Mycenaean political world. Mycenaean dominance over Crete after these destructions is widely accepted among scholars. But they still debate how quickly that dominance developed, how much force it involved, and how much local continuity survived beneath it. But this was never the clean replacement of one people by another. Material culture is not a passport. People can adopt foreign styles, foreign languages, foreign political systems, without disappearing from history. Minoan craft traditions, religious practices, symbols, and local communities carried on. Even the Mycenaean elites who gained political dominance had already been deeply shaped by Crete before that transformation occurred. For generations before that, mainland elites had been borrowing Minoan prestige. Their artists absorbed Cretan movement and marine imagery. Their workshops imported Cretan techniques and objects. Their palaces learned from Cretan architecture and administration. So when Mycenaean authority expanded on Crete, it inherited a system that had already taught the mainland how power itself could look. Knossos suffered another destruction eventually, and its dominance faded for good. Communities across Crete carried on into the later Bronze Age, but the old palatial order never returned in its earlier form. Then, in the 12th century BCE, a much wider collapse struck the entire eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean palaces fell, trade routes fractured, settlements shrank, relocated, or disappeared outright. The people of Crete endured, but the institutional world we call Minoan had, by then, already dissolved. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Civilizations rarely vanish the way legends claim they do. Buildings burn, administrations fail, languages lose their official standing, elites get replaced. But communities survive. They adapt. They intermarry. They remember selectively, keeping some things and letting others go. The Minoans did not step out of history through some trap door. Local communities and elements of Minoan tradition continued within the cultures that followed. Centuries later, Greek myth transformed this island into a kingdom of tribute, invention, danger, and escape. Minos became a powerful king and judge. Daedalus became the genius trapped inside his own creation. Ariadne's thread became the answer to an impossible maze. The Minotaur became the terror waiting at its center. These stories cannot be treated as reliable records of Bronze Age events. But myths were never designed to preserve precise facts. They preserve emotional memory instead. Perhaps they echo the image of a wealthy island, of mysterious rituals, of bulls and skilled craftsmen, and a political power that mainland Greeks once feared, or admired, or both. History forgot the details. Myth kept the atmosphere alive. Modern archaeology then added an entirely new layer of memory on top. Arthur Evans uncovered a civilization the classical world had never fully recognized as its own. His achievement was extraordinary. So, in equal measure, was his confidence. He named the rooms. He reconstructed the frescoes. He raised the columns. He turned scattered fragments into one coherent, unified Minoan vision. Walk through Knossos today, and you encounter three different eras at once. The Bronze Age complex beneath your feet, the ruins the excavators uncovered, and the 20th century world Evans built directly on top of both. And that layered site explains exactly why the Minoans remain both famous and impossible to pin down. They're often described as Europe's first great palatial civilization, yet their world was never separate from Africa, Asia, and the wider Eastern Mediterranean. It was woven into all of it. They're remembered as peaceful, though the evidence cannot prove any island ever lived as a true utopia. They're linked to a king, a goddess, a naval empire, though not one of those three institutions is securely described in the Minoans' own words. In 2025, 6 Minoan palatial centers were inscribed together on UNESCO's World Heritage List: Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, Zomintos, and Kydonia. That decision reflects a genuine shift in how we see them. Minoan civilization cannot be reduced to one palace, one king, one disaster. It was a landscape, connected centers, coastal routes, mountain sanctuaries, workshops, archives, and communities, all bound together. Its rise came from relationships. Its power depended on relationships. And its fall may have been the slow unraveling of those same relationships. Under pressure from disaster, political rivalry, shifting trade, and Mycenaean expansion. But one witness remains silent. More than 1,500 Linear A documents are known today, preserved on tablets, vessels, ceilings, ritual objects. The known corpus has been systematically cataloged. The numerical systems can be studied in detail. Statistical patterns reveal real structure underneath. And yet, after more than a century of effort, no proposed decipherment has won broad scholarly acceptance. Perhaps most of these texts are nothing more than inventories, lists of grain, oil, wool, workers, offerings, debts. But administration, read closely enough, can reveal a civilization in astonishing, intimate detail. One secure title could change how we understand power on this island. One place name could redraw its entire political map. One divine name could transform the study of Minoan religion overnight. A single unexpected phrase could unravel a century of elegant assumptions. Until Linear A is securely deciphered, the Minoans stay behind a locked door. We can map the corridors around it. We can trace their ships, measure the layers of volcanic ash, examine their storerooms, and carefully separate the archaeology from the legend. We can describe how their palaces rose and how their political system eventually collapsed. What we still cannot do is hear them explain any of it. And that may be the final twist in the whole story of the Minoans. The greatest mystery was never simply why their civilization fell. It's whether the history we've built out of their ruins resembles in any way the world they actually believed they were living in.